Listen, the beautiful butterfly still tells us more wonderful stories. Sometimes it's a story about the cat that used to smoke a pipe, or about how a prince was turned into a frog. All sorts of stories. You don't believe me? I'm not lying. That is what it whispered today in my ear. Everyone should listen, even those who doubt. Somewhere in the world there is a country, and in that country there is a city, Rushton. People are always in a hurry, and they are very busy, like hard-working bees. And when sport competitions are on, everybody goes to watch them. Cars race along the streets and planes fly through the blue sky. The city buzzes just as a beehive. Not long ago, in the suburbs of Rushton, lived a good-natured widower with his child, a beautiful young girl. One day he got married, and that is when the trouble started. His new wife was a very haughty woman, and she was lazy and selfish. She had 2 daughters of her own, and they were both very plain and wore gaudy makeup on their faces. They were quite horrible. The young girl was much prettier and cleverer than her stepsisters. This made the stepmother hate her with all her heart. For punishment, she kept the young girl busy by giving her lots of work to do in the house. Soon, the poor young girl was covered in dirt and grime because she never had any spare time to wash her face or even take a bath during the day. That was why they called her Cinderella, because her face was covered in soot from the cold cinders in the fireplace. One beautiful hot day, there was a loud din in the street outside. It was the prince's messenger who had come to announce to the whole city some wonderful news. Listen. Prince Rushton invites all citizens to attend the royal ball tonight. Cinderella's household almost boiled over from the preparations for the ball. The vain sisters bustled about like crazy. They tried on dresses, curled their hair, covered the spots with powder, but for all that, they still looked like frights in dresses. Poor Cinderella spent the whole day running back and forth waiting on the conceited girls. And when evening came, the stepmother and her daughters climbed into the hire car and went to the prince's castle, leaving at home an unhappy and exhausted Cinderella, all alone. Then, suddenly, a distinguished lady appeared before Cinderella. She had a gentle, beautiful face and charming smile. It was her wonderful fairy godmother, Angela. I know what you want, my dear child. You would like to go to the ball tonight at the castle. But I don't have a nice dress, cried Cinderella. Go to the garden and get me the biggest pumpkin. Cinderella went straight outside and chose the biggest pumpkin in the garden. The godmother used her magic wand and turned the pumpkin into a smart carriage, and then used it again to turn Cinderella's dirty old clothes into an elegant ball gown. Remember, To come back home before midnight. When the clock strikes midnight, all of my magic will disappear. Cinderella climbed into the elegant carriage and moments later arrived at the palace doors. She walked timidly up the huge stairs and stepped into the bright ballroom. All the guests immediately turned and looked at her, charmed by her beauty. Cinderella froze from delight. "Who are you, beautiful young lady?" "I cannot tell you just yet," she replied, scarcely believing the prince was talking to her. Suddenly, the clock started to chime the midnight hour. Cinderella, remembering the fairy godmother's warning, wrenched herself from the prince's arms and flew from the castle, leaving one golden slipper on the stairs as she ran. The prince, who was very sad because his new love had disappeared, found the slipper on the stairs. The next morning, the sound of royal trumpets woke the whole city as the prince set out on his search for the mysterious beauty. His messenger knocked on all the doors of the city and said to the women inside, "Good morning, madam. Could you try on this gold slipper?" Unfortunately, the gold slipper was either too large, or too small, or too narrow, or too broad for any of the women's feet. That evening, the exhausted messenger knocked at the door where Cinderella lived. "Does any young ladies live here?" Of course, the big fat feet of the two stepdaughters did not fit the golden slipper. "Are these all of your daughters, madam?" Everyone was amazed when it fitted her foot perfectly. At that same moment, Cinderella magically turned back into the princess, and the happy prince immediately asked her to marry him. Less than 3 weeks later, a great wedding was held in the castle, and the whole of Rushton threw a gigantic party. The streets suddenly became empty. The people stopped being in a hurry, and the skyscrapers seemed to smile in the sun.
Well done.
Next.
done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next. Next. Well done. Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Back to menu.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Next.
Well done.
Back to menu. Well done. Next. Back to menu.
Well done.
Next. Back to menu.
Well done.
Next. Next. Well done. Next.
Well done.
Next. Next, back to menu.
Well done.
Next,
Well done.
next,
Well done.
back to menu.